The cold came without warning in the mountains. One evening in late October, the air still carried the faint sweetness of fallen leaves and wood smoke drifting lazily between the ridges. And by the following morning, the world had hardened into something unrecognizable. Ice formed along the edges of the creek before sunrise. The frost settled so thick across the garden beds that the soil itself looked white, as if the mountain had exhaled and frozen its own breath against the earth. And somewhere deep in those ridges, in the hollows where sunlight arrived late and left early, a family would wake before dawn and begin the work that kept them alive. This was not a romantic life. It was not a simple life in the way that word is used today, stripped of its weight and softened into something comfortable. The Appalachian Mountains stretch from northern Alabama up through Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and into Pennsylvania and New York. They contain some of the oldest geological formations on Earth, ridges already ancient when European settlers first pushed through the passes in the mid-1700s, following Cherokee trading paths worn into the stone over centuries. The mountains did not care about the people who made their homes in the hollows. They offered resources, timber and water and soil, but they offered nothing for free. Everything required knowledge. Everything required work. And perhaps more than anything, everything required a deep and hard-earned understanding of what the land could give and what it would quietly, inevitably take away. The families who settled and stayed in these mountains developed a relationship with food storage that modern life has almost entirely erased. Not the sanitized version of that relationship that sometimes appears in cookbooks and lifestyle magazines, but the genuine, urgent relationship born from the knowledge that a failed harvest or a ruined cellar could mean real hunger by February. These were people for whom the wrong decision in August could echo through January and March, with a cruelty that no amount of determination could fully soften. The geological reality of the region shaped everything about how food was stored. The mountains are not a single continuous ridge, but a series of parallel ranges separated by long, narrow valleys called hollows or coves. These geographic formations created microclimates that varied enormously even across short distances. A hollow facing north might receive only a few hours of direct sunlight each day, keeping soil temperatures dramatically lower than a south-facing slope just a mile away. At higher elevations, some settlements sat above 3,000 feet, and killing frosts arrived months earlier than in the valley communities below. The growing season in some of the highest mountain communities was fewer than 120 days between the last spring frost and the first hard freeze of autumn. That was not enough time to grow most crops to maturity on their own. Survival required supplementing what could be grown with what could be preserved. And preservation required understanding the mountain itself. At the physical foundation of Appalachian food storage was a truth that mountain families knew intimately, and that modern people rarely think about at all. The earth below the frost line maintains a remarkably consistent temperature throughout the year. At depths of 4 to 6 feet in the Appalachian region, soil temperature typically remains between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of whether it is July or January above ground. This natural refrigeration, perfectly stable, and requiring no energy, no machinery, and no ongoing human effort to maintain, was the foundation upon which an entire architecture of survival was built. The most fundamental expression of this knowledge was the root cellar. And the root cellars of the Appalachian Mountains were nothing like the picturesque versions that sometimes appear in old photographs. They were functional to the point of severity. In mountain communities, where level ground was scarce and building materials meant whatever could be cut or quarried nearby, root cellars were typically dug into hillsides rather than straight down into flat ground. This construction approach, called bank cellaring, offered advantages that families understood from experience, even if they could not have explained them in the language of physics. A hillside cellar was easier to excavate because the entrance was already partially exposed to the slope. It was easier to ventilate because the chimney effect of air moving through the sloped interior created natural circulation. And it was more stable against collapse because the weight of the hillside itself pressed against the walls from outside rather than bearing down from directly above, The walls of these cellars were built from whatever stone was available. And in the Appalachians, stone was almost always available. The mountains are shot through with sandstone and limestone, and the freeze-thaw cycles of mountain winters constantly pushed new rocks to the surface of fields and slopes. This frost-heaved stone, collected during field clearing and fence building, became the building material for root cellar walls. The mortar, when mortar was used at all, was often simple clay dug from creek banks, the same clay used for chimney construction and for chinking the gaps in log cabin walls. In some of the poorest and most isolated communities, root cellars were simply caves reinforced at the entrance. Natural formations in the limestone bedrock that happened to maintain the right temperature and humidity already. The mountain itself became the storage space. And families who knew where to find these natural cold spots guarded that knowledge with care. Temperature alone was not enough to preserve food through a mountain winter. The science behind effective root cellar storage, though mountain families would not have described it in scientific terms, involved a precise balancing of temperature, humidity, and ventilation that took generations to learn, and that varied with the specific crops being stored. Apples needed cool temperatures and moderate humidity, but they produced ethylene gas as they ripened, and that gas would accelerate the rotting of any other produce stored nearby. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips had their own requirements. Potatoes needed near darkness and consistent cool temperatures, but would rot in conditions that were too wet. Cabbages tolerated more moisture, but produced sulfurous gases that affected the flavor of nearby foods. The arrangement of a well-managed root cellar was never random. It was the product of accumulated knowledge about which crops could share space, which needed separate containers or different areas of the cellar, and how the cellar environment had to be managed through the careful opening and closing of the ventilation shaft as outside temperatures shifted through the long months of winter. Ventilation was managed through a system that combined simplicity and sophistication in equal measure. Air entered through a low vent near the floor of the cellar and exited through a higher opening near the ceiling. Because warm air rises and cool air settles, this created a gentle circulation that refreshed the cellar atmosphere without dramatically changing its temperature. In winter, the vents were mostly closed during the coldest stretches and opened briefly during warmer afternoon hours. In autumn, before the first hard freeze set the cellar at its winter temperature, vents were opened at night to draw in the cold air and closed during the day to trap it. This process of deliberately cooling the cellar before loading it with the harvest was one of the most critical and knowledge-intensive tasks of the entire year, and a family that skipped it or managed it poorly could find their stored produce beginning to deteriorate weeks before winter had seriously set in. What went into the root cellar reflected the agricultural realities of mountain life, with a directness that modern grocery shopping completely obscures. Corn was the foundational crop of the Appalachian region, and it arrived carrying centuries of indigenous cultivation behind it. The Cherokee, Creek, and other nations of the southern Appalachian region had been growing corn, beans, and squash together in the companion planting system sometimes called the Three Sisters for generations before European settlement began. This system was not simply agricultural tradition. It was sophisticated ecological management. Corn stalks provided structure for bean vines to climb. Bean plants fixed atmospheric nitrogen into the soil, replenishing what the corn extracted. Squash spread across the ground between the stalks, its broad leaves shading out competing weeds and its rough texture deterring some pests. The Three Sisters grown together produced more calories per acre than any of the three crops grown separately, and the combination also provided a more nutritionally complete diet than any single crop could offer alone. The Cherokee practice of processing corn as hominy, using wood ash or limestone in the nixtamalization process, produced a product with dramatically better nutritional properties than simple dried corn. The alkaline processing made the niacin in the corn biologically available to the human body in a way that untreated corn is not. Populations that consumed large amounts of untreated corn as a dietary staple were vulnerable to pellagra, a niacin deficiency disease that produced serious symptoms including skin disorders, severe digestive problems, and neurological deterioration that could be permanently disabling. The Appalachian food culture, shaped by generations of contact and exchange with Cherokee agricultural knowledge, incorporated this protective processing as a matter of practical tradition. Settlers who adopted it were unknowingly protecting themselves from a disease that devastated populations elsewhere in the American South, where the practice was not followed. By the early 20th century, pellagra had become a serious public health crisis in parts of the rural South, killing thousands of people annually. In communities where nixtamalization remained a standard part of corn preparation, that crisis was significantly less severe. The dried corn that went into the root cellar was the product of a harvest process that began in the field and continued in the home across weeks of autumn work. Ears selected for seed were hung in bunches in the barn, kept dry and away from rodents. Ears intended for grinding were husked, dried further, and then shelled by hand. The dried kernels stripped from the cob in a friction motion that left hands aching by the end of a long session. The meal ground from this corn was coarser and more flavorful than modern commercial cornmeal, because it retained the germ, the oily, vitamin-rich heart of the kernel that commercial milling strips away for longer shelf life. This meal, stored in wooden barrels or ceramic crocks sealed with wooden lids, would keep through most of a mountain winter in a properly managed cellar. But the barrel had to be checked periodically for moisture intrusion or insect activity. And a family that discovered weevils in their cornmeal in February faced a crisis requiring rapid and careful response. The mountain practice of burying food extended beyond the root cellar into simpler underground storage techniques that required no masonry at all. A hole dug below the frost line and lined with straw or dried leaves, then filled with root vegetables and covered with more insulating material before the dirt was mounded back over the top, created a storage space called a hill or a clamp. These buried caches were used throughout the Appalachians for vegetables that kept well in the ground. And parsnips actually developed better flavor after frost sweetened their starches into sugars. A transformation that mountain families learned to time and use deliberately. The location of these buried caches was marked with stakes or stones, because a buried cache that could not be found in January after 2 feet of snow had fallen across the ridge was a cache that served no purpose at all. The specific challenges of the Appalachian winter made food storage not a matter of preference, but of survival arithmetic. In the high hollows of western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, and southwestern Virginia, snowfall of 20 to 30 inches in a single storm was not unusual. These storms, driven by the interaction of cold Arctic air masses with moisture-laden systems moving up from the Gulf of Mexico, could deposit several feet of snow over 2 or 3 days, burying roads, blocking passes, and making travel not merely difficult, but genuinely impossible for days or weeks at a time. A family caught by one of these storms with inadequate food stores faced a situation with no good options. There were no food banks, no emergency services, no way to call for help and expect it to arrive in time to matter. Some mountain settlements in the most remote hollows might have contact with the outside world only a handful of times during the winter months, when weather permitted a trip down to a mill or trading post in the valley below. The roads in these communities, when roads existed at all, were more properly described as tracks, unpaved paths that followed creek beds and ridgelines, and that became impassable rivers of mud during the spring thaw and treacherous sheets of ice during cold snaps. A family in a high hollow might be completely cut off from outside resources for stretches of 6 to 8 weeks during the worst winters, entirely dependent on what they had been able to store before the passes closed. This isolation was not an occasional inconvenience. It was a structural feature of mountain life that shaped everything about how communities organized themselves and how each family measured its own readiness. The management of stored apples required particular care because of the apple's tendency to influence its neighbors. An apple that began to rot would, through the ethylene it produced in abundance during that process, accelerate the ripening and then the rotting of every other apple stored nearby. Mountain families who managed apple cellars checked their stores regularly through the winter, removing any apple showing signs of deterioration and eating or processing it immediately. The consequence of failing to do this, of leaving a single rotting apple in the barrel, could be the loss of hundreds of pounds of stored fruit in a matter of weeks. The knowledge of which apple varieties stored best was itself the product of decades of selection and observation. Hard, dense-fleshed varieties like winesap, cultivated in North America since at least the late 1700s, and limber twig, a variety with particular ties to the Appalachian region and documented in American horticultural literature from the early 1800s, were prized not for the flavor they showed at harvest, but for the flavor they developed during months of cool storage. These varieties were astringent and dense in October. By January, after 2 or 3 months in the cellar, they had softened, sweetened, and developed a complexity that fresh-picked autumn apples could not match. The mountain families who planted these varieties were making a sophisticated calculation about time and transformation, understanding that patience and proper storage conditions were themselves a form of food processing. As deliberate and as skilled as anything done in the kitchen, the sweet potato presented a particular challenge and a particular lesson. Sweet potatoes that went into the cellar without proper preparation would rot within weeks. But sweet potatoes that had been cured in a warm, humid space for 10 to 14 days after harvest, allowing the skins to toughen and seal over any cuts or bruises, could keep for months in cool storage. The curing process raised the skin's resistance to the decay organisms that would otherwise find entry through harvest wounds, and it also converted some of the potato starches into sugars, improving its flavor over time in storage. Mountain families who knew this, who had learned it from their own parents and from the communities around them, maintained the curing step as a non-negotiable part of their autumn routine. Families who didn't know it, or who skipped it when time was short, paid for that shortcut in January when they opened their cellar to find the sweet potato bin collapsed into soft, dark decay. The cold, clear streams of the mountain region offered supplementary cold storage that required no construction at all. Spring-fed and running fast over rocky beds, these streams maintained temperatures close to root cellar conditions throughout much of the year. Families who lived near such streams learned to use them as overflow refrigeration. Ceramic crocks sealed with cloth and weighted with stones, placed in deep shaded pools where the current ran steadily, could keep butter and other dairy products fresh for days longer than they would last. In a warm cabin, the stream was not a substitute for the root cellar, but a complement to it, extending the system of cold storage into the landscape itself in a way that required no human effort to maintain. Once the understanding of how to use it was in place, the mountains still stand. The springs still run cold from deep in the limestone. The frost still comes without warning in October, and the hollows still fill with snow that can close a road for a week. And if you walk far enough into those ridges and know where to look, you can still find the remnants of old root cellars, their stone walls slowly reclaimed by moss and tree roots, their wooden doors long rotted away, their carefully shaped cuts in the hillside softened by decades of erosion. They are quiet monuments to a way of understanding the world that valued patience, close observation, and the willingness to work with what the land offered. The knowledge they once held is not entirely gone. It is still there, in the earth, waiting, as it always was, for whoever is willing to learn how to listen.